everyone. It's good to see you all. I see some familiar names. Thank you for joining today too. I know that I've been doing this a couple of times already this month, but today we're going to talk about sexual behaviors or quote unquote problem behaviors. And a little bit about myself is that I've been an educator for over 20 years. I started, well, way back, I was a music teacher. I was a violin instructor. And then I went into special education. I did a residency in New York City public schools and taught elementary education in New York City public schools. And that then led me to going to the University of Washington, where I worked on my doctorate. And now I'm an associate professor for California State University, where I support the credentialing of educators who are also master's students working on their education specialist credential, which is what California calls their special education licensure or credential. I've also been a BCBA since 2011, and most recently moved into direct service providing services to young adults and adults related to sexual problem behaviors. And I work with Empowered. Empowered is a company, an ABA clinic situated in St. Louis, but most of our direct service is through telehealth. So there is some component of in-person if it's in like the immediate St. Louis area, but most of our work is telehealth and providing direct services and staff training related to sexual problem behaviors. And then just to give an additional credential, I completed a certificate in sexual health from the University of Michigan a couple of years ago to reinforce my competency in this area of sexual behavior analysis. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. I've shared my where I'm working and what I do there, but no other conflicts of interest to disclose. My agenda for today is for us to do an overview of quote unquote problem sexual behavior. I also want to spend some time talking about responding to sexual behaviors or behaviors that appear sexual in nature, kind of use that back and forth. And then talking about increasing our comfort in talking about sexuality. So how do we address that discomfort that we feel when talking to children and youth and others about sexuality? I'll have some time for Q&A and then wrap up. I also have some resources to share towards the end as well. My objectives are to have participants learn how to tell when a behavior that seems sexual might be linked to something else, like a medical concern or communication skills. Explore simple, practical ways to respond when sexual behaviors come up that keep a child's safety, dignity, and needs at the center. And then to take some time to reflect on our own feelings and comfort level in talking about sexuality. So how I'm going to start this is we're going to talk a little bit about common sexual behavior. And the reason I approach it this way is that oftentimes we come from, especially in the United States, we don't have a very consistent, strong, comprehensive background in sexuality education. So if you think back to how did you learn about sex ed? Did you have something in school? Sometimes we do in our schools have a fairly strong comprehensive sexuality education program. Most of the times across the United States, it's very, it varies wildly depending on where you are, where you grew up, what your community looked like, what kind of school you went to. And so I like to start here so that we can all have that same foundation on understanding what are some common developmentally appropriate behaviors that might appear sexual. So that kind of takes away the surprise about things. And we kind of have an understanding about this is normal, this is typical development. And then we can go from there. Right. So from ages 2 to 12, these are most of our common sexual behaviors are related to this. They're exploratory and spontaneous. So they're really based in curiosity and just kind of like in the moment happen. There's not a lot of planning that goes into it. There's not a lot of like other outside intention that goes along with that exploration. Typically, it occurs with between or amongst children that are of similar age, size, or developmental level. That is common. If we have, and we'll talk a little bit later, what would be uncommon is if we see wildly different, ages, sizes, those kinds of things, then that's a concern. But common, similar age, size, and developmental level. Also is an intermittent and by mutual agreement. So the children are agreeing to each other to doing something, exploring something, whether it's like curious about kissing or whatever, they explore, and it happens every once in a while. It's not a very constant thing. And if they're caught by caregivers, parents, and they're told to not do that, it usually, commonly, it would stop. All right, these are what we would expect. That would be kind of the typical developmental responses. So some of more specific behaviors we could expect across these age groups. This is developmentally typical behavior that looks sexual in nature. So 0 to 4 years old, typically children in that age range are comfortable being naked. Any of you have younger children and they like to take their clothes off? It has nothing to do, it's not sexual, that's just what they do. That's what younger children do. They take their clothes off for a variety of reasons, but they're just comfortable. They may touch their own genitals because that they may learn by touching that feels good. So it's really not a sexual thing, it just feels good. It's something that feels nice. And so why wouldn't I keep doing that? They might want to touch touch the genitals of other children or adults. They may ask to touch somebody's penis or vagina or something like that, or vulva. They may want to do that, and it's not sexual. It's more in that, again, reminder, that exploratory. They're exploring. They're curious about what's going on. Interest in their parents' genitalia, especially if they don't have that body part. They may be curious about that. They may be interested in watching adults get undressed, and they may also, just a social skill, we know this, like ages 0 to 4, they're not very good at personal space. So they may be very close to others. So I'm telling you all this because this is developmentally typical behavior. This would indicate appropriate for that age group. And so when we start being concerned as if it's happening outside of that age group, then we start being concerned that there's something else going on, right? But this is typical. So if these kinds of behaviors are happening, we would see that as developmentally typical. Ages 5 to 9, they start to want privacy. They may masturbate in private, and they may show some curiosity about sexuality. So maybe asking questions about where do babies come from, talking about getting married and what does getting married mean, and wanting to marry people. So they start showing some curiosity around that. And then 10 to 13, they are likely to start using sexual language. Often that comes from peers. They may show interest in having a relationship with a boyfriend or girlfriend. And then there's continuing masturbation in private. And these are developmentally typical. And then 14 to 17, they might view materials. My other talks have talked more about porn and porn literacy, but that is a very typical looking at materials, whether it's labeled as pornography or something that we wouldn't necessarily consider that. They might view it for arousal, pictures, and those kinds of things that they're interested in. They may have conversations with friends, and they might get involved in some different activities with peers of the same age at that point, sexual activities. So these are very typical sexual or sexual appearing behaviors. Okay. This is a statement I found from the American Academy of Physicians. And it's a little bit dated, 2010, but it still is it's posted on their website, and it's still easily accessible. And this kind of talks about children and sexual behavior. So the statement says that children do not necessarily engage in sexual behaviors for sexual gratification. Curiosity, imitation of observed sexual behaviors, attention seeking, and self-soothing are other reasons children may behave sexually. In general, sexual behaviors that are solitary, like touching one's own genitals, or that do not involve contact are common and frequently observed. It doesn't mean that every child is going to do any of these behaviors, but it's not something that falls out of the realm of developmentally appropriate. So let's talk a little bit about self-soothing. So self-soothing is any behavior that an individual uses to regulate themselves. Typically, they're developed early in life, are repetitive or habitual, and are viewed by a child or youth as a calming or comforting. So you may have some of your own. Maybe it's the use of or you have children that have their own. The use of a particular blanket. Thumb sucking would also be a self-soothing behavior. So there are some behaviors that are okay, that can continue on, or develop into something that's more developmentally appropriate, and some that we have to do some correction on, right? But that's what self-soothing, it's about regulating. So it's used to regulate, and they can be really important for emotional well-being, and we would expect to see them change over the lifespan. So I'm talking about self-soothing because I'm about to talk about masturbation. And I wanted to give a picture of masturbation from early childhood to before. We kind of know what it looks like later on, but what it is when we look at it across the lifespan. So there has been documentation of fetal masturbation as early as 15 weeks gestation. So we want to call that a sexual behavior. That is a self-soothing behavior, right? So that's why we're talking about these two together, right? That's a self-soothing behavior, okay? In infancy, we may also discover, like some infants do discover masturbation. They may self-soothe with the pelvic thrusts, those kinds of things. That is developmentally typical. There are also instances where it becomes a problem, and I will talk more about that when we'll get to that in just a little bit on when does it become a problem. If this is typical, that's okay, but then there's a tipping point where it becomes a problem. And same with toddlers. We often see like thrusting of the pelvis, kind of that rhythmic, self-soothing kind of motion that helps them regulate or go to sleep. We often see that around like nap time or bedtime, trying to bring themselves into sleep. And then in early childhood, we also see this, oftentimes called a humping behavior that is described in early childhood. It tends again to happen around nap times, and it's not sexual, it's about self-soothing. So just being clear about the differences that we don't want to put an ideology onto these kinds of behaviors that isn't actually there. That's not really the purpose of the behaviors. That it's about that self-soothing, about regulation. If it becomes a problem, then we intervene, and that will be fine. Right? So what we do know is that demonstrating sexual behavior does not necessarily indicate child sexual abuse. There are behaviors that are developmentally typical. What I just shared with you, those are developmentally typical and would not be the sole thing that would lead us to determine that there has been a CSA. We would want to look more holistically, of course, but there are also indicators of when to be concerned about a behavior. So if we are concerned, there are steps that we can take. But being aware of the developmentally appropriate trajectory is really important to being able to decide, is this normal, quote unquote normal? Is this typical? Or do I need to be concerned about what is occurring here? So when we're concerned about sexual behaviors is when they're disruptive and or coercive. So if they are being disruptive to the child's life, to the life of those around them, and it's causing some harm in that way, or if it is appearing coercive in nature, that's when we're going to start getting concerned about it. Okay. Disruptive could also be that it's happening so frequently that it's a problem. Like we can't get the child to do anything else. We can't redirect them to something else. Then that's disruptive. And that's when we're going to be concerned about what's happening. So examples of concerning behaviors. These are a few examples. So masturbating compulsively or to the point of causing injury. That's disruptive, absolutely. Pretending to have or simulating sexual activity under the age of 4, that is a concerning behavior. Remembering what our developmentally appropriate was. Developmentally appropriate under age of 4 was not simulating sexual activity, was more curiosity in bodies. Forcing other children to engage in sexual activity would be coercive related behavior, or engaging in sexual behavior with children significantly younger. That's also coercive. Sexual activity with animals, entering the rooms of sleeping children to engage in sexual activity with another child, exchanging money or items for sexual activity, or sending or publishing sexual images of themselves or others. These are all concerning behaviors and should bring up a red flag that this is worth figuring out more about what's happening. These would not be developmentally typical behaviors. This is falling outside of that realm. So what if you're concerned and it's not on that list that I just shared? I can't provide every single possible thing. What I tried to give you was a picture of the developmentally appropriate behaviors and some examples. And if you have a situation where it's concerning because it appears disruptive or coercive, then yeah, it's definitely worth spending time to figure out. A couple of suggestions are to contact a pediatrician to talk about developmentally appropriate behaviors. You can also consult with a sexuality educator or SBA. SBA is a sexual behavior analyst. An SBA is a BCBA that has specialized knowledge and competency related to sexuality. If there's reason to believe sexual abuse has occurred, then of course law enforcement should be contacted at this point too. Just because these are occurring does not necessarily mean that sexual abuse has occurred, but it's something that we kind of bring into our consideration of how did they learn this? Where did they learn this from? Has other contact occurred? Then we want to consider that. It doesn't mean we need to necessarily jump to that, but of course it needs to come up as a possibility that has occurred, that's been learned somewhere else. So contacting a pediatrician, consulting with a sexuality educator or SBA, and if a concern, of course, following your mandated reporter laws as appropriate. And then, of course, if you are a parent or caregiver yourself, then you would contact law enforcement yourself too. So beyond developmentally typical behaviors, there are other reasons a sexually appearing behavior may occur. So one of the reasons that I'm saying that abuse is possible is that there are other possibilities that could be occurring too. And so we want to weigh those as well, and really consider a holistic picture of what might be going on. Instead of jumping straight to abuse, we also want to consider if there's other things happening, like a medical reason, UTI. Does the child have a UTI? And maybe they can't communicate that there's pain. So communication is really key in this too. How much is their communication ability? Are they able to tell when they're in pain or having discomfort of some kind, and where they're having that pain and discomfort? If they're lacking some of that communication skills, they don't have a reliable means of communication, then we most certainly want to consider, is there a medical reason? And that's why as a BCBA, we do functional behavior assessments. And one of the considerations, the first thing we do is figure out, is there a medical reason for a behavior occurring? Whether it's sexually appearing or not, is there a medical reason? Is there an infection? Do they have some pain? Do they have discomfort? Are they sick? And I've had another clinician talk to me about they were consulting on a case where it was a young adult teenager. It was a teenager, and they were the complaint, like, well, not the complaint, but the concern was that this teenager was humping things, going around humping things, especially the floor, and they're just doing it constantly, and they couldn't get them to stop. And the first thing with the functional behavior assessment was a medical reason, was to look at medical. And the teenager had like a stomach infection. They had a stomach infection. And so the humping, what appeared like humping, was actually just trying to relieve the pain that they had in their stomach. So yeah, it looked like humping just by the outsider looking at it, but that was not the purpose of what was occurring there. The purpose there was to try to relieve some of the pain that the teenager was feeling. They didn't have a reliable means of communicating that pain or discomfort they had. So not every instance is going to be a medical cause, but we absolutely want to consider, is there something going on? Urinary tract infection can be really painful. And if it's a child who can't communicate that pain, they may be doing some things that look like masturbation in order to relieve that pain, or doing something that looks that way, and that's not really the purpose behind. Other thing we want to consider are there a lack of skills? So I've told you that starting at around age 9, 10, 8, 9, 10, masturbation in private is actually very typical behavior. But if they are doing that or attempting that and they're not successful with it, they're not leaving satisfied, that also could lead to some frustration, right? And that could lead to some other behaviors that we're seeing. So if they are going to do that, they're already doing it, then we want to check to see, do you have the skills that you need in order to do that? Other skills are public versus private behaviors. It's a really critical skill that I think sometimes gets overlooked because most of us learn that by picking up the cues. But when we have individuals we're supporting who have intellectual disability, they may not pick that up quite as easily. So there might have to be some specific teaching around that. And do they have self-regulation skills? We talked about the importance of self-soothing in early childhood and infancy and early childhood, and that those typically develop across the lifespan into things that are a little bit more appropriate, thumb sucking versus doing something else like taking deep breaths or, closing your eyes or listening to some music. Those kinds of things, they kind of develop into other things that we use as teens, as adults. And if they haven't had the opportunity to develop some of those regulation skills, there might be some things that are occurring that look like sexually appearing behavior, and it's more about they are having a hard time regulating themselves. I talked already about communication and the importance of communication skills. What are those communication skills? Can they tell others if something has happened to them? Can they tell others if they're in pain? Can they tell others where something hurts? That's really important to be able to communicate so that we can support appropriately. Others that we might see, especially in teenagers, is desire with no opportunities, whether there's no solo sex. Solo sex is another word for masturbation. So no opportunities for solo sex, or they're desiring a relationship and they don't have the skills to kind of develop into a relationship. So should we be teaching them some social skills on different relationships? And then, of course, we do want to consider, is it possible that abuse has occurred? And in particular, when we're talking about the IDD population, we do want to be concerned about that because of the history we have, the increased rates of abuse for that population. That is something that we want to consider as well, along with all of these other things that we're thinking about. The important thing that I'm talking about here is to separate the idea of the behavior being sexually charged versus what may actually be occurring. So approaching with curiosity to try to find out what's happening and why this might be happening. And it can be more difficult. It can be easier to do that with other behaviors. And it can be more difficult to do that with behaviors that appear sexual, because we have a hard time with that in society, and in dealing with that. It feels very odd and very awkward to try to address that. But we still want to approach that with curiosity, and try to understand what might else be going on to support that child. So if we're going to respond to the behavior rather than react, is my kind of refrain is to respond, don't react. It's very normal to react. The behaviors can really catch us off guard. Seeing a teenager masturbating in public in a school setting, that's really upsetting. That's upsetting for the educators and other staff that are around. It's upsetting for the other children, the teenagers that are around. That can really catch us off guard, and we can have a hard time like knowing what to do right away, and not reacting. So I just want to put it out there. It's very normal to react to these rather than respond. The caution is that overreacting can exacerbate the behavior. So again, coming from a behavior analytic background, we want to take care in behaviors that don't already have an attention component, a component where attention is kind of helping maintain that behavior. We want to be careful not to add an attention component to a behavior. So we have a ninth grader who has started masturbating in the middle of class. We don't want to then have such a big reaction that reaction becomes really fun to see. And now we have a teenager who is masturbating in school for whatever reason originally caused it, not understanding private versus public or some other reason, whatever that is. And now also they're looking for that really fun reaction from us. So we want to be really careful about that, and not adding on to what is already occurring. So responding keeps us in a space of being curious. That also helps us to be curious, right? We always want to plan for prevention rather than always reacting to things. And that kind of helps us stay in that space. So some of my recommendations for this are to take a deep breath as much as possible, use our own regulation strategies. What was it? I was just telling my my graduate students last night was that whenever we're handling something, we want to be able to take a deep breath and put that away for a moment. And we'll be like, we'll come back and deal with that. I'll process that later. But right now I have to handle what's in front of me. So I'm going to take a deep breath. I'm going to compartmentalize that for now. I'll come back to it, process it later in my own space, and handle what I need to handle right now. We can redirect as appropriate, depending on what the behavior is. We can spend some time reflecting on our values about sexuality. That's kind of a little bit later. And then come up with a plan. So now we've seen this happen. How do we come up with a plan for this, right? Plan to address is we want to find out, is there a medical reason? Like I just covered, UTI, gastrointestinal issue, pain, discomfort. And then if it's not medical and it's not developmentally appropriate, we consult further. So that may be reaching out to a pediatrician, reaching out to an SBA or a sexuality educator, but somebody who has competency and experience around sexuality and sexual development, right, and sexual behaviors. So we can consult further if we're not comfortable figuring out what's moving, what else is going on. If we do find out, again, of course, if sexual abuse has occurred, then law enforcement should, of course, be contacted. And the other thing that we can do to respond rather than react to behavior is to access resources. So the more information we have, like you are here, right? Gathering information, finding those reliable sources. It's not an island. You don't have to come up with it on your own. There are lots of resources available. And like I said at the very start of this, we are often lacking knowledge ourselves. Sexuality education in the US is sorely lacking. We are not very good with comprehensive sexuality education consistently. And so we ourselves don't always have all of the knowledge about sexuality and to be able to access. So we might have to go and find out more about that. And, as a result of not having access to that education, we can find that we're not very confident in addressing sexual behaviors. And that confidence can be really important, right? Seeing a teenager who's masturbating in public and I don't know how to do this. I don't know what's supposed to be like, I don't know what to do. Like that's a lack of confidence, and that's very normal. That's very typical. So we can gather information and resources in order to learn more about how to react and how to do that. So, all right, more specifically, what can I do in the moment besides what I just said of like taking a deep breath? Okay. Again, respond, don't react. Gentle distraction. So, I just finished telling you we want to avoid having a big reaction in order to not draw a bunch of attention and kind of potentially create a situation where, ooh, that was a really fun reaction. Like I got a lot of attention. And even though it may seem like, well, that's not very fun attention to be like yelled at to get your hands out of your pants. That's still attention. It may not seem fun to us, but to somebody who's on the receiving end, they might be like, oh God, that got your attention real quick. I might do that the next time I need your attention. So we want to be really careful about that. So gentle distraction is what I recommend. Gently distracting is quietly, you need to get your hands out of your pants, okay? Gentle redirect, if it's appropriate, take their hands in yours. If it's your own child and they're younger, that's appropriate. If it's not your own child, whether they're younger or older, that is probably not going to be appropriate. Just depends on what your relationship is. If you're a staff member, then we try to not put our hands on others, but we can distract with like a different activity or something else that they can do with their hands. You can also tell them like, okay, that's a bathroom or private bedroom. Like you can go do that in the bathroom in a private space. Okay, so now we're redirecting that this is not appropriate in public. This is now appropriate. This is where you can go do that. That's appropriate. That also gives us more information on where we might want to support in skill development as well. So sexuality can be a really difficult topic for a lot of people. It can be really difficult for parents and caregivers to address with their children. And children and youth with IDD, intellectual and developmental disabilities, are frequently left out of sexuality education. Or if they are included, it's not always provided in accessible ways. So the information is not provided in a way that supports their learning styles and the opportunities they need to practice skills and have information reinforced. So even in states where there is an automatic or there's an opt-in option, what my experience has been is that oftentimes parents of children and youth with IDD are too nervous to have their child involved in that sexuality education for a lot of reasons, mainly fear of what kind of information is going to be provided to their child, fear that if the child isn't showing at that moment anything that would be indication of interest in sex or sexuality, that then having sexuality education will lead to them wanting to do certain things or wanting to talk about things. And that's valid. That's absolutely valid for parents and caregivers. The research we have shows that that's not really what happens. That actually more education leads to a reduction in those kinds of behaviors, and in the desire, like learning about, and sexuality education has kind of a, people kind of can misunderstand what sexuality education includes. And it's, as I was telling a guardian not that long ago, is that I am not here as a sexuality educator to teach anybody how to do the act of sex. I am here to teach about all of the things around it, about how to have healthy relationships, about boundaries, about yes, birth control and sexually transmitted infections. I'm trying to teach the skills that all surround that, because usually people can figure out how to do that if they really want to. And I don't need to be the one that teaches that. But I can teach how to advocate for yourself, what a healthy relationship looks like, and how to break up in a healthy way if that's what's appropriate, how to pursue relationships in a way that isn't creepy, and that is respectful of all. I can also teach consent skills and what consent looks like. So that misunderstanding around the term sexuality education can often be a reason why youth and children with IDD are left out. And so it's understandable, like understandable that we misunderstand what that's all about, because many of us didn't go through sexuality education or good comprehensive sexuality education as teens ourselves. So what this all does, though, is it puts parents and caregivers in the position of being the sole provider of information on sexuality. And that can be really challenging, to be able to find the information, find it in a way that meets the needs of your learner, of your child, and includes all the components that you want to have included. So all of that is about reflecting on sexuality yourself. And this is kind of something that we do as sexuality educators. So I'm giving you a little piece of that when you're trained to be a sexuality educator, or you go through training to become a sexuality educator. There's a lot of reflection. And so I think it's really valuable for parents and caregivers to also spend a little bit of time reflecting themselves and thinking about this. What are your values related to sexuality? And how did you get to those values? Is it coming from your background and experiences? Did your parents teach you about sex ed or sexuality education? Do your values come from your religion, from other experiences, from your cultural background? All of that is valued, all of that is valid, but it all makes up our values. And as a parent, parents have the right to instill their values about these topics in their children. And so reflecting on that and being able to name some of that is really helpful. We also want to reflect on our own experiences related to sexuality education. Was it from your parents? Was it from school? Did you go somewhere else? Did you learn about it from your peer group, from your friends? How did you learn? And, you know, many of us in the elder millennial and above generations, we were like sneaking things out of our parents' books. We were looking through encyclopedias and looking at that. And now today, a lot of teens are using the internet to find a lot of information. And so being aware that that may be where children and youth are getting that information. And so just reflecting on the differences of that experience, of how you might have found information versus how your children may be finding information. And then I think it's also valuable to reflect on how we react in different situations, and doing that before something occurs. can be really helpful. So reflecting on how do you react under pressure when there's a stressful situation? What is your typical response to that? And do you have any strategies that you use to keep calm in stressful situations? And if you don't have any strategies, then can you find a handful of things to try out and practice those so that should something occur, our reaction can be, we can pull those strategies. We don't have to like think really hard about it. We can just use it intuitively. The experiences I've had talking to parents, I have worked with parents who have regretted reactions that they've had. I've worked with parents who found that their teen was viewing pornography to like a really great extent to what was concerning for them, and in different spaces and those kinds of things. And the reflection I got from them was that they wish they would have reacted a bit differently. That their reaction was very, very big at the onset, the first, finding of that situation. And they wish that they would have had more strategies to, they could take back that reaction and respond in a different way. And so I worked with them on finding some strategies that could help kind of calm their system in the moment and be able to work towards responding better. So some of my online resources, I know I shared these at my last presentation just last week, but Amaze is one that has really great videos and guides for parents to be able to talk about topics. And so I think that that one's a really useful one related to what we've talked about today. There's also my other resources I've shared before, which is the porn conversation, Elevatus training. They have some really nice resources for parents and guardians that are really easily accessible. So even if you're not going to do the curriculum or the online trainings or workshops, there are resources on the Elevatus site that are really easily accessible and I think very friendly articles to read. And then I have book resources, a few that kind of support being able to talk about sexuality and sex ed. Sex is a Funny Word is a very friendly book. It's very colorful and very interactive. Porn is Not Sex Ed is a brand new one. That one is also very interactive and is really intended for parents to go through with their youth, with their children too. So is What is Sex? That's also a very parent-friendly resource as well. And the other two are more about kind of skill development as well, but they're very useful resources around personal health and hygiene, on taking care of myself, and then dating, something that our teens are very interested in. So that is what I have for you all today. I have time for any questions.